Chapter 17. Hume. David Hume, 1711–76, is one of the most important among philosophers, because he developed to its logical conclusion the empirical philosophy of Locke and Berkeley, and by making it self-consistent, made it incredible. He represents, in a certain sense, a dead end. In his direction it is impossible to go further. To refute him has been, ever since he wrote, a favorite pastime among metaphysicians. For my part, I find none of their refutations convincing. Nevertheless, I cannot but hope that something less sceptical than Hume's system may be discoverable. His chief philosophical work, the Treatise of Human Nature, was written while he was living in France during the years 1734 to 1737. The first 2 volumes were published in 1739, the third in 1740. He was a very young man, not yet in his 30s. He was not well known, and his conclusions were such as almost all schools would find unwelcome. He hoped for vehement attacks, which he would meet with brilliant retorts. Instead, no one noticed the book. As he says himself, it fell dead-born from the press. But, he adds, being naturally of a cheerful and sanguine temper, I very soon recovered from the blow. He devoted himself to the writing of essays, of which he produced the first volume in 1741. In 1744 he made an unsuccessful attempt to obtain a professorship at Edinburgh. Having failed in this, he became first tutor to a lunatic, and then secretary to a general. Fortified by these credentials, he ventured again into philosophy. He shortened the treatise by leaving out the best parts and most of the reasons for his conclusions. The result was the Inquiry into Human Understanding, for a long time much better known than the treatise. It was this book that awakened Kant from his dogmatic slumbers. He does not appear to have known the treatise. He wrote also Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, which he kept unpublished during his lifetime. By his direction they were published posthumously in 1779. His Essay on Miracles, which became famous, maintains that there never can be adequate historical evidence for such events. His History of England, published in 1755 and following years, devoted itself to proving the superiority of Tories to Whigs, and of Scotchmen to Englishmen. He did not consider history worthy of philosophic detachment. He visited Paris in 1763, and was made much of by the philosophes. Unfortunately, he formed a friendship with Rousseau, and had a famous quarrel with him. Hume behaved with admirable forbearance, but Rousseau, who suffered from persecution mania, insisted upon a violent breach. Hume has described his own character in a self-obituary, or funeral oration as he calls it. I was a man of mild dispositions, of command of temper, of an open, social, and cheerful humour, capable of attachment but little susceptible of enmity, and of great moderation in all my passions. Even my love of literary fame, my ruling passion, never soured my temper, notwithstanding my frequent disappointments. All this is borne out by everything that is known of him. Hume's Treatise of Human Nature is divided into 3 books, dealing respectively with the understanding, the passions, and morals. What is important and novel in his doctrines is in the first book, to which I shall confine myself. He begins with the distinction between impressions and ideas. These are 2 kinds of perceptions, of which impressions are those that have more force and violence. By ideas, I mean the faint images of these in thinking and reasoning. Ideas, at least when simple, are like impressions, but fainter. Every simple idea has a simple impression, which resembles it, and every simple impression a correspondent idea. All our simple ideas, in their first appearance, are derived from simple impressions, which are correspondent to them, and which they exactly represent. Complex ideas, on the other hand, need not resemble impressions. We can imagine a winged horse without having ever seen one, but the constituents of this complex idea are all derived from impressions. The proof that impressions come first is derived from experience. For example, a man born blind has no ideas of colors. Among ideas, those that retain a considerable degree of the vivacity of the original impressions belong to memory, the others to imagination. There is a section of abstract ideas which opens with a paragraph of emphatic agreement with Berkeley's doctrine that all general ideas are nothing but particular ones, annexed to a certain term, which gives them a more extensive significance and makes them recall upon occasion other individuals which are similar to them. He contends that when we have an idea of a man, it has all the particularity that the impression of a man has. The mind cannot form any notion of quantity or quality without forming a precise notion of degrees of each. Abstract ideas are in themselves individual. However, they may become general in their representation. This theory, which is a modern form of nominalism, has two defects, one logical, the other psychological. To begin with the logical objection, when we have found a resemblance among several objects, Hume says, we apply the same name to all of them. Every nominalist would agree. But in fact, a common name, such as cat, is just as unreal as the universal cat is. The nominalist solution of the problem of universals thus fails through being insufficiently drastic in the application of its own principles. It mistakenly applies these principles only to things, and not also to words. The psychological objection is more serious, at least in connection with Hume. The whole theory of ideas as copies of impressions, as he sets it forth, suffers from ignoring vagueness. When, for example, I have seen a flower of a certain color, and I afterwards call up an image of it, the image is lacking in precision, in this sense that there are several closely similar shades of color of which it might be an image or idea in Hume's terminology. It is not true that the mind cannot form any notion of quantity or quality without forming a precise notion of degrees of each. Suppose you have seen a man whose height is 6 feet 1 inch. You retain an image of him, but it probably would fit a man half an inch taller or shorter. Vagueness is different from generality, but has some of the same characteristics. By not noticing it, Hume runs into unnecessary difficulties. For instance, as to the possibility of imagining a shade of color you have never seen, which is intermediate between two closely similar shades that you have seen. If these two are sufficiently similar, any image you can form will be equally applicable to both of them and to the intermediate shade. When Hume says that ideas are derived from impressions which they exactly represent, he goes beyond what is psychologically true. Hume banished the conception of substance from psychology, as Berkeley had banished it from physics. There is, he says, no impression of self, and therefore no idea of self. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. There may, he ironically concedes, be some philosophers who can perceive themselves. But, setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. This repudiation of the idea of the self is of great importance. Let us see exactly what it maintains and how far it is valid. To begin with, the self, if there is such a thing, is never perceived, and therefore we can have no idea of it. If this argument is to be accepted, it must be carefully stated. No man perceives his own brain, yet in an important sense he has an idea of it. Such ideas, which are inferences from perceptions, are not among the logically basic stock of ideas. They are complex and descriptive. This must be the case if Hume is right in his principle that all simple ideas are derived from impressions, and if this principle is rejected, we are forced back on innate ideas. Using modern terminology, we may say, ideas of unperceived things or occurrences can always be defined in terms of perceived things or occurrences. And therefore, by substituting the definition for the term defined, we can always state what we know empirically without introducing any unperceived things or occurrences. As regards our present problem, all psychological knowledge can be stated without introducing the self. Further, the self, as defined, can be nothing but a bundle of perceptions, not a new, simple thing. In this I think that any thoroughgoing empiricist must agree with Hume. It does not follow that there is no simple self. It only follows that we cannot know whether there is or not, and that the self, except as a bundle of perceptions, cannot enter into any part of our knowledge. This conclusion is important in metaphysics as getting rid of the last surviving use of substance. It is important in theology as abolishing all supposed knowledge of the soul. It is important in the analysis of knowledge, since it shows that the category of subject and object is not fundamental. In this matter of the ego, Hume made an important advance on Berkeley. The most important part of the whole treatise is the section called Of Knowledge and Probability. Hume does not mean by probability the sort of knowledge contained in the mathematical theory of probability, such as that the chance of throwing double sixes with 2 dice is 1/36. This knowledge is not itself probable in any special sense. It has as much certainty as knowledge can have. What Hume is concerned with is uncertain knowledge, such as is obtained from empirical data by inferences that are not demonstrative. This includes all our knowledge as to the future, and as to unobserved portions of the past and present. In fact, it includes everything except, on the one hand, direct observation, and on the other, logic and mathematics. The analysis of such probable knowledge led Hume to certain skeptical conclusions, which are equally difficult to refute and to accept. The result was a challenge to philosophers, which, in my opinion, has still not been adequately met. Hume begins by distinguishing 7 kinds of philosophical relation: resemblance, identity, relations of time and place, proportion in quantity or number, degrees in inequality, contrariety, and causation. These, he says, may be divided into 2 kinds: those that depend only on the ideas, and those that can be changed without any change in the ideas. Of the first kind are resemblance, contrariety, degrees in quality, and proportions in quantity or number. But spatio-temporal and causal relations are of the second kind. Only relations of the first kind give certain knowledge. Our knowledge concerning the others is only probable. Algebra and arithmetic are the only sciences in which we can carry on a long chain of reasoning without losing certainty. Geometry is not so certain as algebra and arithmetic because we cannot be sure of the truth of its axioms. It is a mistake to suppose, as many philosophers do, that the ideas of mathematics must be comprehended by a pure and intellectual view, of which the superior faculties of the soul are alone capable. The falsehood of this view is evident, says Hume, as soon as we remember that all our ideas are copied from our impressions. The 3 relations that depend not only on ideas are identity, spatio-temporal relations, and causation. In the first 2, the mind does not go beyond what is immediately present to the senses. Spatio-temporal relations, Hume holds, can be perceived and can form parts of impressions. Causation alone enables us to infer something or occurrence from some other thing or occurrence. It is only causation which produces such a connection as to give us assurance from the existence or action of one object that 'twas followed or preceded by any other existence or action. A difficulty arises from Hume's contention that there is no such thing as an impression of a causal relation. We can perceive, by mere observation of A and B, that A is above B or to the right of B, but not that A causes B. In the past, the relation of causation had been more or less assimilated to that of ground and consequent in logic, but this, Hume rightly perceived, was a mistake. In the Cartesian philosophy, as in that of the scholastics, the connection of cause and effect was supposed to be necessary, as logical connections are necessary. The first really serious challenge to this view came from Hume, with whom the modern philosophy of causation begins. He, in common with almost all philosophers down to and including Bergson, supposes the law to state that there are propositions of the form A causes B, where A and B are classes of events. The fact that such laws do not occur in any well-developed science appears to be unknown to philosophers. But much of what they have said can be translated so as to be applicable to causal laws such as do occur. We may therefore ignore this point for the present. Hume begins by observing that the power by which one object produces another is not discoverable from the ideas of the 2 objects, and that we can therefore only know cause and effect from experience, not from reasoning or reflection.